right, so this is a paper that's going to kill everybody because it's financial again. Have you seen that? All the financial papers are at the end of the day, so that it's going to be very difficult. All right. We would like first to thank the organizers of the conference for their kind invitation. And as you see, we will be two speakers, Jules Buffet and myself. And I have to say that it's Jules' first paper, so I have to be nice with him. It's interesting to note that the present conference has oscillated between two rather different themes. First, the question, so to speak, of how Athens in the Hellenistic period might constitute a kind of isolate in the midst of the Great Convergence coined by John Ma, on the basis of Louis Robert's work, of course. And second, the initial question of assessing the potential Athenian institutional and cultural legacy throughout the Hellenistic period. The first point I would like to underline here is the fact that in the French epigraphic tradition, Hellenistic Athens is not, let's say, not always at the center of the whole reflection, I guess out of fear of the deadly Athenocentrism, as Mirko said yesterday, and therefore did not necessarily constitute an obvious model that other cities or regions would have followed from its classical roots. This does not discredit the question posed, of course, because the circulation of models, whether cultural, institutional, or political, is an essential point for understanding the societies of Hellenistic cities. In this respect, I would probably prefer to make use of another type of theory, that of cultural transfers, as developed in France from the 1980s by Michel Espagne and Michael Werner for German studies, and much more recently, Madalina Dana and Ivana Savali in a collective work published in 2019, which is on the screen, La Cité Interconnectée. Such a theory, where a reception, adaptation, and incorporation are fundamental, is certainly a powerful tool of analysis. It's also deeply linked with the concept of networks applied to ancient history. It is thus necessary to wonder how these transfers were likely to operate for regions neighboring Athens, and yet very different in terms of institutional traditions. Such is thus the case of Hellenistic Boeotia, which presents, of course, common points with its neighbor and often rival, in particular the existence of democratic civic regimes, but also a major difference, the organization as a koinon. In this respect, Athens stands out again as an exception in the Greek world of this time, whereas the majority of the cities existed within supracivic organizations, as was underlined yesterday by Manuela Mari. Boeotia was indeed organized between 335. Sorry. Non, c'est pas ça. Non. Quelque chose qui a sauté. Okay, sorry. Between 335 and 171, on a very innovative model constituted of 7 tele districts, or rather contributing teams. This period in the life of Boeotian cities has provided the greatest number of inscriptions, like the one we will present to you today within a micro-historical framework at the level of a citizen of Thespiae, Nikareta, in conflict with another Boeotian city, Orchomenos. In the last third of the 3rd century BC, this Thespian lady lent money to the Orchomenians and, for lack of refunding, decided to start in 225 or 224 a procedure to recover her money, which makes her a true anti-Euergetes. The city of Orchomenos finally paid back the sum, and wishing the state of affairs and its capacity to extinguish the debts to be known, the city had the whole of this complex and fascinating financial file engraved. Here you see the inscription, within which we will trace possible Athenian institutional eruptions. And Jules will deal now with first the presentation of the stone and the financial issue.
Vous coupez votre son aussi. Thank you, Professor Müller.
Thanks to the organizers. Thanks to the organizers also for having me here. So our inscription, which you can see in the handout, consists of 8 documents that can be distinguished from one another only from their content, as the inscription runs continuously without any line break. The engraving order of the documents, mentioned in the inscription itself, on lines 29 to 38, differs from their chronological order. The case can be reconstituted quite accurately thanks to the decree, number 2, ordering the engraving of the documents. No problem. The protests, number 4, show that Nikareta of Thespiae, daughter of Theon, lent money to the city of Orchomenus at least 4 times for a total of 17,585 drachmas, so a little short of 3 talents. The city did not repay her in time, and its guarantor, a Thaian son of Cinnamos, mentioned in the protests, was apparently unable to bail it out. This first legal action, so the protests, was obviously inconclusive, and Nikareta entered negotiations with the Orchomenian chief officials, the polemarchs, in order to obtain repayment of the loans. This negotiation resulted in an agreement, number 7, between Nikareta and the city of Orchomenus, arranging for the repayment of 18,833 drachmas, so a little over 3 talents. The agreement includes the drafting of a fictional contract, which will be the focus of our attention later on. This contract, document number 6, creates a new loan, but Nikareta obviously did not give such money to Orchomenos. This contract only replaces the protests for the purpose of repayment, unless Orchomenos fails to repay. In that case, Nikareta will be able to demand both the 18,000 drachmas from the contract and the 17,000 from the protests. The city would thus incur a penalty of almost double of the original amount. It is unclear, though, how the negotiations unfolded, but Nikareta appears to have had the upper hand, since the polemarchs say they were forced to sign the contract, lines 45-46. At any rate, Nikareta achieved her goal, and the city used all its resources, lines 59-60, to repay the 3 talents. Now, this inscription is a rare example of a comprehensive dossier concerning financial interactions, which includes complete legal documents. This makes it a valuable source of information, but bears a risk of building circular arguments due to the scarcity of relevant parallels. A unique feature of this inscription, to which these methodological scruples fully apply, is the fact that the contract is drafted in Koine, while the rest of the inscription uses the local Boeotian dialect. This was noticed by almost all scholars, but curiously drew little attention. Louis Gernet suggested the now generally accepted idea that the contract was written in Koine because this type of document originated in Athens. While this seems to be the most, if not the only plausible explanation, it requires further investigation to determine what exactly was imported from Athens, or at least imported from the Koine zone, which is larger than Athens, into the Boeotian legal procedure. I shall now turn to the details of the financial aspects. It appears the Boeotians lacked the concept of a financial contract, that is, of a legally binding document allowing the creditor to exact payment from his or her debtor without a courtroom ruling. In other words, it lacked the procedural tool to enforce its confederal law. On this confederal aspect, more hereafter. The agreement specifically requires such a contract to be drafted, indicating that the agreement, document 7, is in itself as a document not legally binding. This is particularly clear at the end of the agreement, which states that upon repayment by Orchomenos, the contract is to be handed over to the polemarchs. Moreover, the contract itself stipulates that it will be valid even if someone else produces it instead of Nikareta, making it some kind of a bearer contract. But was it only because the Athenian contract was legally binding that Boeotia borrowed it? Or was this import part of a broader influence of the Athenian legal and financial system? This question hinges on that of the controversial unity of Greek law, and as such cannot be extensively and properly addressed here. However, a particular aspect of this contract can help shed some light on the difference between the Athenian and the Boeotian legal systems regarding financial transactions. And that may lead us to view this transfer as an active borrowing on the Boeotians' part, rather than the sign of a center to periphery Athenian influence. Our contract bears a remarkable degree of resemblance to that preserved in Demosthenes' speech against Lacratus, which is admittedly a century older. But it differs noticeably in respect of the types of surety mentioned. In both cases, the formula naming the creditor is the same, Idaneisen, Nikareta, Idaneisen and Procles, etc. Then the interest rate is mentioned. But while our contract goes on directly to specify the delay for repayment, the Demosthenian contract makes an extensive mention of a load of 3,000 wine amphoras serving as mortgage for the loan. The debtors must buy these on their first stop in Mende Ostione, and the amphoras will remain the property of the creditor until the loan has been repaid. This seems to have been standard practice in Athens. The corpus of mortgage stones, or horoi, discussed yesterday by Julien Faguer, shows that debtors had to provide a specific and precisely identified asset as surety, and the creditor could dispose of it in case of default or late repayment. Yes. Now, as Nikolaos Papazakadis pointed out, this time about land leases and not loan contracts, this was not the case for all Athenian contracts. He writes, outside of state-conferred leases, placement of sureties was the exception rather than the rule amongst the Athenian political subunits. But financial loans are quite different from land leases, which always include what we could call an equivalent of a surety in the form of the leased land itself. In case of default, the landlord can always terminate the lease and recover his capital, the land. Moreover, it seems that placement of sureties was indeed used for larger transactions, state-conferred leases, in Papazakadis' words. This also appears in an inscription from Curios, which you can see on the screen, studied by Isabelle Pernin, which mentions a threshold of 10 drachmas for rents, beyond which a surety was mandatory, while a guarantor was enough for lower rents. In our inscription, on the contrary, the only type of surety are individuals designated as anguoi for the loan, namely the original guarantor, Thion, son of Synamos, mentioned in the protests, and 10 citizens named in the contract. The 3 polemarchs and the head treasurer of Orchomenos are designated as debtors in the contract instead of the city, but they can be considered as guarantors because of the fictitious nature of the contract. They do not actually receive the money. All 14 of them are liable to seizure on all their possessions, not on specific assets that would have been given to Nikareta until full repayment of the loan. So while seizure of assets is attested both in Boeotia and in Athens, in Boeotia, this remains a general possibility, the burden of the procedure resting on the creditor who had to negotiate with his debtor. Now, debtors were not necessarily better off in the Boeotian system, as all the available evidence indicates that loans were ultimately actually repaid, albeit with delays and possibly lessened penalties or interests. Nikareta was nonetheless unable to exact payment from Theon or Komnenos' guarantor, although the inscription does not tell us why, since no mention of him is made except in the protests. This would not have been the case in an Athenian legal frame, which would have allowed her to directly sell the assets placed as surety without having to engage in negotiations with her debtors. Now, this inscription is indeed an exceptional document and remains the only epigraphic example of a loan contract in Boeotia. However, it seems that the standard practice in Boeotia was to use either guarantors or general collaterals, such as the city's income, for instance, in the form of epinomia, that is, the right to use civic land as pasture for cattle free of charge. And of the 7 Boeotian instances of public loans recorded by Leopold Mijotte, all dating circa 200 BCE, only one mentions sacred land as mortgage, using the same phrase, epi plus dative, as in the against Lacretus contract. From these documents, it appears that Boeotian cities could place their civic pasture as surety for loans. But again, contrary to what we see in Athens, the creditor did not seem to have an automatic right of seizure in case of default. It was rather customary to negotiate and restructure the loans. Another contemporary Orchomenian example of this habit is the recently published inscription by Yannis Kaliansis mentioning a contract, so a syngraphos, drafted according to an agreement, which is called symbolon in that inscription. This inscription, unfortunately, gives little detail on the procedure itself. A more detailed example, is the agreement between the cities of Corsiae and Thisbe. The city of Corsiae, unable to repay its neighbor Thisbe, restructures a loan of unknown amount into 11 yearly installments for a total amount of circa 15,000 drachmas. Like in Nikareta's case, the debtor was able to get an extension and thus prevent the creditor from seizing assets. The same verb as in our inscription is used to refer to the negotiation, peito. The agreement includes the right for Corsiae, the debtor, to collect revenue from its land provided it pays the installments. This means that revenue from the land of Corsiae was mortgaged, but not in the form of a one-time transfer of property when the loan was made. The creditor was rather given a general right of seizure on all the debtor's property, and the conditions of the seizure had to be determined through a negotiation. So, to sum up, it appears that whereas in Athens, specific assets were placed as surety, which creditors could dispose of immediately in case of default, on the other hand, Boeotian creditors had to negotiate with their debtors because of the general nature of the collaterals used. Now, this difference might be due to the fact that the loans known in Athens are mostly loans between individuals, while those from Boeotia involve cities and individuals, or cities and cities. Unfortunately, due to the lack of sources regarding loans between individuals in Boeotia, this problem can currently not be decisively addressed. I shall now leave it to Professor Müller to comment on 2 other aspects linked with the problem of Athenian influence in Boeotia: the legal capacity of women and the role of the Boeotian Confederacy.
Thank you, Jules.
Christel, you have to unmute.
Okay, sorry, I had not activated my microphone again. Another specificity of this inscription concerns indeed the place occupied here by this exceptional woman, Nikareta of Thespiae. Whether the case is representative and whether it might be another example of circular reasoning arises here again, since Nikareta's position is constantly cited about the possible legal and economic autonomy of women in the Hellenistic period. This woman is certainly rich and her wealth is personal. There are some nice parallels of such a situation in Boeotia. This explains why Paul Reusch, as on the screen, wrote that in classical and especially Hellenistic Boeotia, women enjoyed some consideration and had a privileged social status compared to the neighboring areas. However, things are far from being so simple, as Nikareta is flanked by her husband, Dexippos, during certain operations. That's how we will return to the question of the link with Athenian institutions. Dexippos appears indeed beside his wife in two documents, the two main documents, the agreement number 7 and the contract number 6. In the agreement, the husband is there as an assistant, and which is not to be mistaken with the role of witness, histor, as in the protests, number 4. The text says, and you have that on the screen, I've highlighted it in bold, Pariontos Nikarete Dexippo Enomidao to Andros Thespieios, that's on line 4951, present at the proceedings, Pariontos, with the verb pareimi followed by the dative. Likewise, there are assistants who are present, pareian, for the city, and who are the polymarchs, line 52, 53, also on the screen. There is, in fact, a slight difference between parousia, what I call parousia plus dative, and parousia followed by hyper. In the first case, it's indeed a matter of assistance to a specific individual, whereas in the second case, the presence instead of someone means a way to represent him. Here, the polymarchs act on behalf of the city. And it should be emphasized that the city appears here as detached from the human group, which makes it as if it had a moral personality, which is pretty rare for me, if I'm not wrong about inscriptions. There are excellent parallels to this practice of assistance. In the leases of Thespiae already mentioned, all the lessees of the Guai Stili, for instance, whether men or women, are flanked by guarantors, prostatae, and some also have assistants beside them. 2 of the 3 women for 6 contracts who take out a lease are thus assisted by their husbands, while 1 is assisted by friends, philoi. The male individuals assisted by friends are most certainly minor children. The other parallels is that of manumissions, where female owners of slaves are assisted by their husbands. To return to Nikareta, a husband is qualified, Et alors la suite, il n'y a pas de suite. In the contract, her husband is qualified in the contract this time, so number 6, by another term which sounds to us much more familiar, that of Curios. And that immediately raises 2 questions. The first question is whether or not the assistants of the agreement, land leases and manumissions, are, in the case of women, the equivalent of the Curios. And the second questions consist in wondering about the origin of this terminological variation within the same epigraphic file. The answer to the first question, whether or not the assistants are the same as the Curios, is not exactly simple. The Boeotians in the financial documents, which follow local procedures and are written in regional dialect, never use, to our knowledge, the term Curios to designate a woman's tutor, brackets. This term is obviously not unknown to them, but it's used in Boeotia in only 2 cases, to signify the capacity at the time of a manumission offered to the priest, the hierarchs, and the synedroi to use seizure and punishment, or to signify in a very common way that a document will be validated. Everywhere else, when a husband is present beside his wife during a legal act, he's said to be simply an assistant. It would thus seem that Boeotia is a region without Kyriea. One could find normal that the Boeotians for the Boeotians to be closer to continental Greece, in areas such as Phocis, Thessaly, Locris, Epirus, Aetolia, known to be regions where the documents do not mention any Curios. Does that mean that women have more freedom here, in particular at economic and legal levels? Nothing is less sure. In the case of Nikareta, it is clear that whatever the term used, Curios or Paron or Parion, the husband has to be there when it comes to concluding a legal act. The male presence in the case of Nikareta has thus been interpreted in various ways. Either it's taken as a simple legal formality and in fact the wife acts as she wishes. This is the classical interpretation, that of David Chaps, for instance. Or the husband would in fact act through his wife, even if she seems to be at the forefront of the scene. And this is the opinion of Rit van Bremen. In reality, there is no way of deciding, since by definition, as Rit reminds us, we only have the cases where the man has given his assent. We can therefore readily agree with her that, I quote, it's on the screen, rather than focusing too specifically on the Curios as a locus of male control, we should therefore see him as just one expression of that control. His occasional absence from a document does not by itself signal a change in the structures of authority within families. Yet, it remains difficult to conclude that there is a perfect equivalence between assistance and Kyriea. The parousia, assistance, seems to benefit from a wider extension, as Laurence d'Armezan has well shown in connection with manumissions. First, it concerns women and minor children, but also certain adults who could enter the category of senile old men fallen into a form of legal incapacity. On the other hand, this parousia can take a collective form and not only an individual one, with series of friends, philoi, as we've seen, exercising it together. The fact is attested both in the manumissions and on the Guai stele. These philoi are in general, not surprisingly, members of the family, but it's not excluded that they belong to a wider circle of hospitality. One should therefore be careful not to assimilate too quickly the parion and the Curios, even if in fact the difference in the case of women must have been slight. The answer to the second question, the difference in terminology between Curios and assistant in the Nikareta inscription, brings us back again to our subject, because it certainly provides one more piece in the puzzle of the entanglements between Attic and Boeotian institutions. If the term Curios appears here, it might be precisely because it's included in the contract in koine, which we have already seen was certainly borrowed from Attic procedures. The formula in which the term appears results from a hybridization. Parontos ote curio. Don't know if I've got. No, not yet. Yeah, sorry, it's on the screen. Sorry. Parontos ote curio to andros, etc. The first two terms are typical of Boeotian procedure, and they translate the parousia into koine, while the third term, Curios, can only be an Athenian graft. Even if we have no Attic contract mentioning a woman with her Curios because of the very nature of the sources, we have traces of this situation on several mortgage horoi, notably in Amorgos. The islands belong to the Attic influence zone, as Julien Faguet has shown, and we can reasonably deduce that women could enter into a contract with the assistance of their husbands. That the contract itself is an import is also seen in the irresistible return to the Boeotian dialect at the end of the Syngraphe, when it is said to be preserved at Viphiadas, son of Timocles. But this contract that stands out in Nikareta's dossier presents still another characteristic. It was passed, like the agreement, under the protection of the Boeotian koinon. So I'm shifting to my last point, which is the crucial question of the role of the koinon in this case. When did the koinon intervene? As long as the case remains between the Thespian Nikareta and the city of Orchomenos, the magistrates, as well as the dates and places mentioned, belong to one or the other city. But when Nikareta decides to get her money back at all costs, the matter moves up to the supra-civic level. The first clue lies in the sudden mention of the federal archon Onassimos, the one who allows us to date the file to the year 2232 in the two main documents, the agreement and the contract. These two pieces follow one another closely and are even to date of the same month in the same year, and the same month is Panamos, the 9th month. Whatever the place where they were sealed, probably Thespiae, their conclusion was thus necessarily made under the aegis of the koinon. The second clue is the mention in the contract of a law according to which kataton nomon, and that's on line 28-29, and it's been already alluded to by Jules, according to which the borrowers or guarantors will be subject to a procedure of execution of the repayment if they are in default. This law has been interpreted as a federal law, quote, on the collection of debts by Paul Roche, and rightly so, if it would seem, because only a law by the koinon could be imposed jointly on the two cities and their citizens. Lastly, the deadline of refunding is fixed at the great common festival of the Boeotian, the Boeotia, which took place in the sanctuary of Athena Etonia in Koroneia during the month which bears their name, Boeotios, which is the 10th month of the year. The exact date of the repayment is even set to the 3rd day before the sacrifice of this festival. That's line 21-27. This is short, 1 month after the agreement and the binding contract were concluded. But this precise date is interesting in itself. It seems that within the framework of the koinon, the conflicts between cities had to be solved by the time of the common meeting, and more particularly before the sacrifice. In other words, it seemed unthinkable that the Orchomenians would drag their antagonisms until then. One can even possibly make the hypothesis that the Panegyris was one of the solving places for such conflicts, and that a court of arbitration internal to the koinon might then have been held. And it is not forbidden to think that the case was evoked during this festival. Indeed, the city of Orchomenos exceeded the term by 3 months and proceeded to the refunding only in Alalkomenios II during the 13th intercalary month. Well, to conclude briefly and to return to our question, the institutional bond with Athens. All elements of analysis converge to indicate an active transfer of legal practices from Attica to Boeotia. Or should I say finally, after hearing all of you for the last 2 days, finally beyond Athens from the Koine zone that definitely included far more polis. The introduction of such a type of binding contract could only be the fact of the koinon. The patience and the protests having proved inefficient, the magistrates of the Confederacy were asked for help and chose a tool which was not part of their legal arsenal. They borrowed it from their Athenian neighbors while arranging it as they wished. They preserved the Ionian Attic dialect, which is interesting in itself, but they adapted this specific type of document into their own set of legal practices, which feature most notably negotiations and agreements made after default, rather than specific sureties given at the time the loan was made. They also grafted on it the presence of the husband as assistant while adding the term Curios, and integrated the mention of a federal law. But it would be going too far to claim that the Boeotians borrowed from Athens the whole package of legal procedures regarding financial loans. This was more an interpretatio boiotica of a specific document than anything else. Thank you for your attention.